If you remember last week, we started talking about fundamental issues in social psychology that are almost philosophical in nature. What is human nature? Is it good? Is it bad? What did we learn last week? What is our conclusion regarding human nature? Is it good or is it bad? What do you remember? What do you mean? Oh, not bad, but not necessarily good. Can you elaborate a little bit? Like under what circumstances, or what does it mean not bad? Yes, okay. So pretty good. So initially, social psychology findings claim that people are inherently bad, and there are all sorts of classic experiments like the Stanford prison experiment, the bystander effect. But we saw that actually some of this evidence is flawed and need to be revisited. There is one thing that we saw that was quite solid and replicated quite well, which is the Milgram experiments, which means that we have the capacity for being corrupted, being obedient to those in authority that demand us to do bad things. But on the other side, on the flip side, we saw some recent evidence from CCTV footage and the lost wallets that actually suggest that people do not stand by, people help and intervene in 90% of the cases. 3 or 4 people actually put themselves in danger in order to help other people. Many of the lost wallets were returned, especially the more money that was in the wallet, the more likely wallets were to return. So a lot of assumptions that we had previously in social psychology, now we understand there might be some context to it. We need to revisit them, we need to refresh them. This week, we're gonna go a step further and talk about honesty and unethical behavior. So this relates a little bit to some of the fundamental findings about human nature. Under what circumstances do we behave badly? So I'd like to start as usual by asking you some questions about your own intuitions. Let me just start with the Mentimeter over here. Go on the Mentimeter and rate the following behaviors, both for yourself and for the average HKU student. And the kind of behaviors that we're talking about when we talk about honesty and unethical behavior in the context of a university are some of the following behaviors. And perhaps you've heard about these behaviors, or you had the conflict and dilemma of whether to engage in these kinds of behaviors. This is something that often, in the ethics committee and sometimes as an educator, we have to face these kinds of behaviors. So the first one is about your engagement with the parents, lying to parents about school performances. How do you rate yourself? How do you rate the average HKU student? And then exaggerating your accomplishments on an application. Let's say that you're applying to an industry job or applying to grad school. How likely are you or the average HKU student? Using false excuse to delay taking an exam or turning in an assignment. How likely the average HKU student? And receiving substantial help on an assignment when the instructor asked for individual work. How likely you? How likely other people at HKU? Good. So before I show you the results, now you've done our assessments, you're working on replications, you have some idea of the experimental mindset, the scientist mindset. So before I show you this, what am I trying to look into here? What is a possible prediction? What's going on over here? What could this be about? As experimental scientist, what's interesting for you in this kind of questionnaire? Yeah, deviant behavior, good. Do you see any experimental paradigm here? Self and other biases, right? So if we look at the differences between self and other, do you have any predictions on what we might find over here? We often think of ourselves as better compared to others. Okay, yeah. All agree with this? Thank you very much. Agree? Any other predictions? Something else that's interesting to you about here? So if I show you the results, you would expect to see others behaving more badly, more likely to behave in negative behaviors than others. All right, so let's look at this. As the experimenter, were your hypothesis supported or not? Seems like a strong support for this. Why? Because for every 2 behaviors. We have first the person, so the self, and then others, the average HKU student. I usually run this in larger classes, large samples, and it doesn't matter how many people in the class, and whether I ask about HKU or ask about this classroom, and sometimes even when I ask about teams, it does seem like we perceive ourselves to be more honest than others about all kinds of these engagements. Another research question that you could have asked yourself is that, so what is the one that people engage in the most of all these unethical or dishonest behaviors? So which one seems to be like the most prevalent over here? Exaggerating accomplishments on an application seems to be like the highest one compared to the lowest one, which seems to be lying about parents. So something interesting about this, no? So when we apply for jobs, tend to exaggerate things more than we do to our parents. However, if you think about this logically, what is the problem with this kind of reporting? Actually, there's a lot more potential for self-harm when you report something bad, that you exaggerate your accomplishments to a company, and they find out, even if it's 20 years later, you're already the CEO, if they find out that you've exaggerated something on your CV, then this can really backfire. You can get fired, you can get sued. So actually exaggerating things on a CV or in a job application is much worse than to your parents, because parents can forgive. Parents can understand if you do this in a job, that's going to be big trouble. And I know of many case studies where people exaggerated things on their applications and they really had to pay a lot for that. Next question. This is, I think, something that is, a common question when we study unethical behavior. So now I'm trying to ask you something very specific about lying. So how many times in the last month have you lied? Try and estimate, give some estimation, whatever your definition is of lying. And then on a scale of 0 to 10, how honest would you rate yourself? Okay, so with the experimenter scientist mindset, what is this one about? What do I want to show you here? Framing. What about the framing? Oh, the 10 plus. One is count and one is a scale. Right? The first one is a count. The second one is like a scale 0 to 10. Okay, so there's a difference between these two. But you were talking about something else. What is framing? Pretty high? Oh, pretty low. Okay, yeah. So I could have arranged the scale better if it's like the counts. 0 to 100 maybe? 0 to 1 million, depending on how big a liar you are. Okay, good. Anything else? All right, so before I show you this and before we talk about what this is, I'm gonna introduce a little bit about how we define what is unethical behavior and how we define what is morality. Many times we confuse the two. When people talk about immoral, they also talk about unethical. I try to differentiate the two. Sometimes I will confuse the two in the lecture, but typically when I do research on this and when I write papers on this, we tend to differentiate these into two different things. So if you look at the definition for what is unethical, it's a violation of widely accepted rules, laws, and regulation. So there's a clear rule that says, do not do this, and you did this or anyway. So you violated something that was clearly stated. So let's say there's a regulation at HKU, or there's a law that tells you in Hong Kong, do not do something, speed limit or crossing the street, or do not steal. And then you violated this kind of rule. Morality is a bit more complicated because it's more about a unifying system of all kinds of guiding principles to define what constitutes right and wrong. And sometimes you and I can have different guiding principles. Two different people can have different definitions of what is moral and what is not moral. So easy to think about this in the context of religion. So religions really tend to judge one another. What you're doing is a sin, what you're doing is a sin. So disagreeing of what this unifying system of guiding principles are. Typically the moral domain started, a lot of research started to get a real boost in the US given the differences between liberals and conservatives, the Democrats and the Republicans, who have very different ideas regarding the same issues about equality, of what is freedom, how do you define freedom, sense of authority, or morality in the sense of in-group, out-group relationships. So how much do I emphasize the in-group compared to the out-group? The best way that I tend to think of it is using these cartoons. So unethical behaviors is like a clear violation. So receiving a bribe or giving a bribe is an obvious violation of a law. You should not do this. Morality, here's a good cartoon that I really like about these two women. One thinks everything covered, but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture. And the other is nothing covered, but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture. So sometimes these two really clash, and one person judges the other, and sometimes it's very difficult for them to coexist or to be able to interact about their morality. So we're gonna focus mainly on the left one, on clear violations of rules. And in the following sessions, in the next few weeks, we talk more about morality. But this one is more about behavioral ethics, the approach of violation of clear rules, regulations, and laws. The main figure that I will discuss today, there are quite a few people in this behavioral ethics group, but the main figure that I will discuss today is Dan Ariely. We discussed Dan Ariely before. Do you remember in which context? So Dan Ariely has two domains. One is judgment decision-making. So predictably irrational, talking about all the biases and everything that we teach in the other class in judgment decision-making. So he's a big figure in irrational behavior and what is the deviation from the Homo economicus classic economics theories. But his other domain is about morality and unethical behavior. And he, together with a group of people, started a whole new perspective of ethics. So up until, let's say, the 70s and the 80s, we had this notion that there's some people who are criminals or some people who behave very, very badly, and some people that don't. So 100% bad to 100% good. And there's no real way for us to study this other than indirect observations or something using indirect data. But the behavioral ethics group said that we can actually study these things in the lab. The two big projects that he came out with, this is the first one that came out as a book. It's the honest truth about dishonesty. It's terrific. It's recently been updated. Still some findings in there, and we'll talk about this towards the end of the session today that I think need to be updated. But generally, this is the book that for the first time summarized everything about how to study behavioral ethics, how to look at unethical behavior in the lab, how to use this in experiments. This one over here on the right, Dishonesty, the Truth About Lies, is a movie that Dan Ariely did using Kickstarter. So I wish more academics did this kind of thing. He did crowdsourcing when he went to the public and he said, if you've read my book and you liked it, if you read my research and you liked it, if you watched my TED Talk and you liked it, please help me fund a movie that I will do about dishonesty. And he actually went and he interviewed, together with another director, a lot of people who behaved unethically. For example, sports people who doped, so cyclists that use drugs that they're not supposed to use in sports, or finance people that actually stole. And they put them in front of the camera and they asked them, what led you to this kind of thing? And then they connected this to some findings. I watched this when this came out. It was in Belgium. I was living in Maastricht University, an hour away. It was wonderful to sit together with an audience and watch this movie. And it's, I think, the best communication that an academic can do to the public. So some of the things that I will show you today are actually from this movie, highly recommended, should be available, something in the internet. All right, so we did the self-reporting behaviors and evaluating others. So I asked you, how many people think that they're more moral than others, lied once or more in the last week. Rate yourselves. I'll show you the first video.
How many people here have lied at least once since the beginning of 2014? How many people here think of yourself in general as honest, wonderful people? The same group. How can it be? How can it be that at the same time we think of ourselves as honest and then we recognize that we're dishonest? It turns out it's all about rationalization. On one hand, we want to look at the mirror and think that we're good, honest, wonderful people. On the other hand, we want to benefit selfishly from being dishonest. As long as we cheat just a little bit, we don't have to pay any price in terms of the image and the way we view ourselves. And we call this the fudge factor. So this is the ability to misbehave and think of ourselves as good people. And you can think about all kinds of ways in which in your own life you have a fudge factor. The speed limit. Maybe it says 55, but are you okay in driving 60? What about cheating a little bit on taxes? What about exaggerating their online dating profile? Across many studies, we find that everything that changes the fudge factor also changes people's ability to be dishonest. There are dozens of elements that can change the magnitude of the fudge factor. And we've been able to observe many of them in the lab. For example, if you can say to yourself, everybody is doing it, it's easier for you to rationalize to yourself that this is actually an okay thing to do and cheat to a higher degree.
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with Dan Ariely, actually he has a very interesting personal story. Perhaps from his accent, you can also tell that he's not American. He, like me, was born in Israel, and he'll talk a little bit about that later on. Also, his life story is that when he was in high school, in the Scouts, he was badly hurt, burned in half of his body. So actually there's a major disability, and it's remarkable that despite this disability, he is a great communicator. He talks to others, overcomes, perhaps some of the barriers that people have and their insecurities and the lack of self-confidence, and he puts himself out there. And in some of the videos that we'll see, either this week or in following weeks, you'll sometimes see him with half a beard. It's because half of his body is burned and he cannot grow a beard. So he's a very interesting character. And based on his own experiences, he wanted to understand better why people act in all sorts of predictably irrational ways, or why people are dishonest about the things that they do. So he combines his own personal story with the research that he does and the way that he communicates this here in the movie, but in other places in the TED Talk. So let's look again at our findings over here. So some of you have lied in the last month, 5.6. Many of you have, it's 4 of you, that 10 plus. There's one person who is very, very honest. It seems to be like 0 lies whatsoever. And most of us, even though we're somewhere here on the scale, at least 1 lie in the last month, scale of 0 to 10, we perceive ourselves to be 7 as honest. Now, what's interesting about this finding? What is it that you can observe over here? So first, of course, that there's the this disconnect between the fact that we're lying and the fact that we see ourselves as generally honest. What else do you see here? What's the issue with the first question? When I ask you, how many times did you lie in the last month? What are some of the challenges with this question? We don't remember. We barely remember how many lies we did yesterday. Let's say a week is stretching it. A month, how to even do this? So when I ask you this kind of question, how do you calculate? How do you give me an estimate? If people don't remember, what do they do when they see this question? Guess how? How do you guess? Oh, okay, right. So do the second first, and then according to that, adjust to the, okay, yeah. We have all sorts of interesting effects in judgment decision-making called anchoring. So you were talking about the 0 to 10 plus. So that's an interesting anchoring effect where the first number that we see affects, and we tend to go for the easiest question. The second one is easiest because we know how much we rate ourselves. Like recalling stuff, that's tough. So when we ask in your replications and extensions, we ask participants to do all sorts of things. We really need to think, is this request really possible? Are we asking them something that they can really do? So in most of these questions, first of all, this is self-reported. Do we trust what it is that people report here? Let's say all of you said 0. Can we trust 0? Do people really report what it is? So there's a problem of self-desirability. So we want to appear to ourselves as being, so just like you said, first answer the second question. We like to think of ourselves as honest, and then, but another way is like, even if we try to be honest about the first question and the self-reporting, it's a big question. How do we recall this sort of thing? And then people make all sorts of calculations. Maybe I can recall that yesterday I lied once. So if I multiply this by 30, then I lied 30 times, therefore 10 plus. Or I didn't lie yesterday, therefore perhaps if I multiply that, I didn't lie in the past month. So it's interesting sometimes to ask people, how do you answer this kind of question? Plus, and I think this is the most frustrating thing for me as somebody who studies honesty, is that if somebody says that they're lying, how do you know that they're not lying about saying that they're lying? Or if they're saying that they're honest, how do you know that they're not lying about saying that they're honest? So there's an inherent conflict in this kind of question. It's almost useless, other than, of course, getting some metacognition about what it is that people usually report here. But then, in order to overcome this, we know that self-reporting unethical behavior is problematic. And we know that people want to hide their unethical behavior. They don't want me to know about this as the researcher, and there's self-desirability bias. Then, as experimenters, as scientists, how do we study this kind of behavior? What else can we do to study unethical behavior to overcome the problem of self-reporting? You have any ideas? Let's say that you want to observe all these problematic behaviors in HKU. How would we know? Okay, experiments, terrific. Let's think of an experiment. Do you have an idea of how to run experiments about unethical behavior? Quiz? Terrific. So we have a quiz, and you need to get to a certain goal, like 7, for example, out of 10, in order to get an award. And then people who might not get 7, might get 6.5, might report themselves as being 7, let's say 6 instead of 6.5, 6 instead of 7, but they want to receive the prize, so they'll exaggerate. How would we, this is terrific, we'll show an example of this. How would we know exactly how many they got correctly? Trust us that we're not going to look at this. Okay, terrific. So we can look at them as a group. It's all anonymized, and then we can average everybody in the group and see what the average is. And if the average is less than 7, obviously there's some lying over here if they claim the prize. So that's terrific. This is very much in line with what Dan Ariely and this behavioral ethics group did. So I'm going to show you some videos about how they accomplish this, and they have all sorts of different paradigms, and we'll discuss some of these paradigms.
Dishonesty and cheating are interesting, fascinating topic. And it turns out that it's not just about how we cheat other people. It's also how we cheat and rationalize our own behavior in our own eyes. And the two most interesting findings we have in this is, first, that it turns out that a lot of people cheat, but they cheat just a little bit. We find it much easier to cheat, and we get away with it, we rationalize it, and we end up not thinking of ourselves as being cheaters. The second thing is that when we deal with things that are not money, they could be other things. They could be tokens, they could be balls, they could be pencils. We find it much easier to cheat. So it turns out that people feel comfortable with themselves taking office supplies from the office home. They don't think of themselves as bad people. But if you ask the same individuals whether they would take 10 cents from a petty cash box when there's no chance that anybody would ever find out about it, they will say, of course not. And the interesting thing is, what is it about the fact that when something is not cash, when it's office supplies or other things, we feel so comfortable?
Yeah, so initially when we thought about unethical behavior, we thought, okay, there's really bad people and there's really good people. There's nothing in between. But Dan Ariely is actually suggesting that we all have the capacity to lie as long as we can maintain the concept of us being good, honest people. How to do this? We rationalized all kinds of things. So for example, we might not take money that we see on a table, but if we work somewhere, then using the office supplies or taking something from the office, we can rationalize to ourselves that this is something that comes with the job, or this is something that we deserve, or this is something that I should have gotten in my salary, but since my salary is so low, then I can compensate for it some other way. He talks about the fudge factor, so all kinds of different factors for why people behave dishonestly. So for example, a big one is everybody is doing it. So perhaps you're an HKU student and you're doing something that you know is in a violation of a rule at HKU, but you tell yourself, it's okay because everybody else is doing it. Therefore, perhaps nobody is enforcing this rule. Perhaps it's completely okay and this rule is outdated. Therefore, I can also do this. And sometimes it's a little bit dangerous when we move from one environment to another. Perhaps there's an entire law that is not enforced in one institution, but is enforced in another institution. So we really need to keep track of, when we say everybody, who is everybody? Where does the social norms go? And is there really an alignment between social norms and the laws? So it could be that HKU is saying, we don't care much about this, but then let's say Hong Kong government says, we really care about this, and then they do something about it. I'm not hurting anyone. So if I take this money or if I speed a little bit, I'm not really hurting anybody. Nobody is being affected by this. So that's another way of rationalizing things. Lying for others, I think, is not studied enough in our literature. Many times we lie to protect our parents because we want them to think of us as these successful kids, or we want them to be happy about who we are and what we're doing. So perhaps we wouldn't tell them about somebody that they don't want us to date, or we don't tell them about our bad performance. So all these kinds of things, it's not that we aim for harming our parents. It's actually quite the opposite, to protect them. Plus, if you think about this, sometimes we can do something that's towards somebody else. Let's say pharmaceutical companies would charge us money in order to buy a medicine. Maybe we can't afford this, in order to treat somebody that needs medical treatment. Is it okay if I go and I steal something from a pharmacy in order to treat someone? Do they have the moral capacity to decide whether I can get treatment or not? So many people decide, okay, the pharmaceutical companies are wrong. This pharmacy denying me of drug is wrong. I should get healthcare, or this person needs to be treated. Therefore, I'll go and I'll steal it. So lying for other people, or stealing for other people, behaving unethically for other people is sometimes something that people use and rationalize in order to overcome laws, rules, and regulations. Fatigue, sometimes we're just tired and we don't pay attention to things as much. Distance from the crime. So money seems to be very direct, but if we steal tokens or office supplies, this is one step removed from actual money. So sometimes we convince ourselves that this intermediate, far removed from money, is okay. There's a lot of self-deception going on. So the initial view was good versus bad, but I think Dan Ariely and the behavioral ethics team showed us that actually there's 1% that perhaps are always bad, and 1% that are completely good, like this one person who says they've never lied. And then you have this 98%, which is all of us, that have the capacity to lie and do unethical things in the right context, given certain circumstances. We all are very good at rationalizing all kinds of things. We cheat more when it's for other people. So depending on the motivations, there are some motivations that are stronger than others. And there's a slippery slope. So perhaps when we're young and innocent and we haven't done anything wrong ever, then lying seems like a big thing. And the first time that we lie about something, we're very, very worried about this. But once you overcome that, the second lie seems a lot easier. And the third lie is almost fourth and fifth, almost natural. So it's a slippery slope. So when you start acting unethically, if you've already done one lie about late submission or about something in the course, then the second one doesn't seem to be as bad. You're kind of like on a roll. So I need to be careful of this slippery slope and be very attentive to how one dishonest thing leads to another. We discussed all kinds of issues with self-reported behavior. So if we can't use self-reported behavior, we want to examine the experimental approach. And this is how I'm going to show you two videos from Dan Ariely's movie. And then we can discuss on all sorts of different things that we can manipulate with these experimental paradigms.
Just have a seat anywhere with a packet and a pen in front of it.
We gave people 20 simple math problems.
find the two numbers that add up to 10.
These are problems that everybody could solve if they had enough time, but we don't give people enough time.
We are going to give you 5 minutes to solve as many as possible.
At the end of the 5 minutes, please stop, put your pencil down and count how many questions you got correctly. And now that you know how many questions you got correctly, take the sheet of paper, go to the front of the room, and shred it. People do that, they come to the front, they say they solved 6 problems, pay them $6, they go home.
There you go, thank you for participating.
What the people in the experiment don't know is that we played with the shredder. The shredder shred the size of the page, but the body of the page remains intact. And what do we find? On average, people solve 4 problems and report to be solving 6.
I solved 6.
I don't know if this is embarrassing or not, but I got 6.
I believe I got 7 right.
70% cheated on this, and they ran this on a large sample. Anything interesting about the first video? What did you see? What's interesting to you about everything that you just saw? What kind of interesting observations, questions as researchers that you want to ask about this one? This is kind of similar to what it is that you suggested, right? Anything curious about what you just saw? So you had whether they get an award or not get an award. What's the difference with this one? Okay, yes, right, yeah. Yeah, so a lot of interesting observation. Okay, let's take this one by one because you mentioned a lot of things. First of all, 70% cheated, but how did they cheat? Most of them got how many out of the 20? How many did they get? They got 3 or 4. How many did they report? 6. One of them said 7. What's curious about this? As researchers, what's confusing about this? Yeah, so for you, it's like either they get it or they don't get it. And in order to get it, they need to go. But here it's more like a continuous variable of how much they cheated. So we know how much they got and we know how much they reported. So we have a continuous variable of how much they reported more than that. So it's slightly more accurate. Plus you can see a distribution. You don't have a distribution whether, 0 or 1. They either lied or they didn't lie. Here we can see to what extent they lied. So what's interesting about this distribution? What's curious about this? If you lie, and you want to get the award, why not say you got 20? Just get the $20, right? So why do people report 6 or 7? What's curious about this? Why is it 6 or 7? Why isn't it 8 or 9? Why isn't it 5? Rationalizing. So how would you rationalize 6 or 7? So it's $2 more, right? Yeah. Okay, for who? Let's say who? For us. Okay. Yeah. Good. So there's 2 people who this can be okay for. First of all, for you, you really think, I think I'm better than this. So perhaps, I can do 2 more. I was about to, just like the time or something like that. Or somebody can say, it took me a long time to come to this experiment. So I deserve these $2. They owe me. They should have paid better for this experiment, therefore I can do $2 more. $2 seems reasonable, so that's on my side. On the other side is, if I'm gonna say 20, perhaps they'll know immediately that I'm a cheater because nobody can do this 20, and then they'll do something about it. Even if we reassure them completely, don't worry, whatever it is that you say, you're gonna get it. People don't do 20 because perhaps they're afraid of being punished or detected or that everybody around them will judge them in some way. So even if they're anonymous, even if there's no problem whatsoever with the researcher, even if there's no researcher, people still do 6 or 7 rather than 5 or 20. So it's really interesting how people rationalize things. I won't show you how Daniel really describes this today, but one of the interesting things that he did with vending machines. Sometimes, we go to a vending machine and we pay the money, we put in the coins or we use our octopus, and then we select what it is, the snack or the drink that we want, and then it gets stuck or it doesn't come down. And then there's a contact number that says, if there's a problem with this machine, please call this number. How many people call the number? Not many, but there are some. And if you ever have to go to a call center and listen to some of these conversations about how people report not getting their snacks, people are very upset. Sometimes they take it out on the machine, they rock it or they hit it or they punch it. So Dan Ariely decided to do something different. He actually bought a few of these machines and he changed something in order to run the experiment. And in these vending machines, he tweaked them so that when you pay for something, actually it doesn't work with an octopus, but it goes with the coins. So if you put in the coins and you select a snack, the snack comes down, but you also get back your money. So actually, there's the capacity for you to receive something for free if you wanted to. Now, the question is, how many people call the call center to tell them, hey, do you have a problem with your machine? It's broken, I got the money and I wasn't supposed to get it? 0. Not surprising, nobody is reporting this sort of thing. But what is the interesting experiment with this? The interesting experiment is, how many more snacks are they going to take? How many more drinks are they going to take? So what's your hypothesis about how many drinks or snacks beyond the one free one that you got? How many more are people going to take? You can take the whole vending machine, bring this to the entire class, right? So all your classmates can enjoy this. How many do you think they usually take? A guess? 2 or 3? Okay, great. Why 2 or 3? Oh, just the effort of putting on the. Okay, so amount of effort, 2 or 3. That's really good. What Dan Ariely did is that after somebody, they watched how many people put the coins and take, and then when they walked away from the vending machine, the experimenter came from far away and came and said, this is actually part of the experiment. Don't worry, you can have all of this. This is yours. We have also additional money if you're willing to answer some questions. And then they asked them, so when you saw this kind of thing, what went through your mind? So it's interesting because actually the second one, many reported that the second one that they took is because why? People are curious. Is this going to happen again or not? We really want to test this. So we're all a little bit like experimenters. So they put in and then they see the second one. So, okay, so this machine is broken. So now I know for sure. And it's interesting to see what happens after the second one. So do you stop at the second one or not? And usually people proceed to the 3 or 4. It's interesting to see how they rationalize this. The number one reason was most of the people can remember a time when they went to a vending machine and put in money and they didn't get their snack and their drink. So they think all of the vending machines are cousins and they're all related to one another. Therefore, I deserve this. I remember that cousin didn't give me my drink. Now I can get my drink back. Plus, perhaps there's too much effort in getting more than that. So really interesting stuff. You can think about how to do this with shredders, how to do this with covering and hiding this from the experimenters, but having some indirect way. But you can even do this with vending machines. So lots of cool stuff coming out from behavioral ethics. And I'm going to show you a follow-up video on how they took this even a step further with having a confederate. So having an experimenter that is acting in order to test something very specific.
Good morning. We want to talk a little bit about dishonesty. To measure dishonesty, we do all kinds of things. One type of experiment, we use a die. We give people a 6-sided die, and we say, why don't you roll the die, and we'll pay you whatever it comes up on. It comes on 6, we'll give you $6, $5, and so on. But you can get paid based on the top side or the bottom side. You decide, but don't tell us. You roll the die, and let's say it came with 5 on the bottom and 2 on the top. And now I say, and what did you pick?
Bottom. Okay.
If you picked bottom, you say bottom, no problem. But if you pick top, what do? Do you say the truth, top, and get only $2? Or do you change your mind and say bottom and get $5? And when you do it 20 times, you find that people are incredibly lucky. But today we have 2 versions of this experiment. We have one version that at most you can make today $4. We have another version that at most you can make $40. Why don't you toss a coin and we'll see which one you got? People toss a coin and no matter what happened, we say, oh, sorry, you got the $4 version. But then the research assistant looks around, he says, listen, My boss is not here today. So I'll tell you what. You got $3 to show up to the experiment. If you will give me these $3, I'll pretend you got the other coin flip. So the research assistant is asking him for a bribe. What percentage bribed him? 90%. 90% bribed. They just moved from a $4 version to a $40 version. They were going to get much more money. What happened to cheating? More or less the same? More cheating. And not only did they cheated more, they started stealing. What do I mean by that? People have this sheet. I chose 5 and 2, I chose 5 and so on. So they sum up how many points they have, and let's say we owe them $23. And we say, here's an envelope with $50. Why don't you pay yourself the amount of money you deserve? The amount of money you don't deserve, leave in the envelope, and as you leave the room, there's a big box with all kinds of envelopes, drop it there. In this corruption experiment, it was the first time we saw stealing. People also wrote 23 and took more money. So when we think about culture, there's a really worrisome thought. Think about lots of people who behave honestly and some people who don't. And what happens if those people establish the social norm? And what if those people are in a position of power? When you get into a system and something in the system tells you that things are wrong there, all of a sudden you abandon your own moral fiber. This is about the fact that if the person running the system is telling us that corruption or dishonesty or something is allowed, our understanding of what is acceptable changes instantly.
So a lot of interesting things in here. So here we see another type of experiment, this time with a die. You toss a die and then you ask them, is it the top or is it the bottom? And people report this, and then you see on average, on aggregates, whether they are more than the random likelihood of getting the prize. Plus, there's the additional confederate that is offering them a bribe, and then seeing whether people actually go along with this or not. And if you think about these rates, just how much corruption there is, and this is just an experiment, and this is every one of us, 90%. Of people who are cheating in just going to an experiment. I think the most important thing that I wanted you to get from this, and I think this is the irony of us as researchers, when we do research about unethical behavior, what does this require us to do? In many of these things, what actually happens? We lie to our participants. We deceive them. So there's a lot of irony in this, that we have to fool the participants in order to get them to behave in an unethical manner. Now, as researchers, how do we overcome this conflict of us lying in order to observe lying? How do we overcome this problem? What are typical things that we do as researchers? Debrief, that's one of the things. What is debriefing? Yes, good. So first we conduct the experiment. Perhaps even we finish conducting the experiment for all of the sample, because we don't want them to tell each other what we're doing. And then after all of this is done, we debrief them, we get them into a room and we say, actually, the experiment was about this. We had to observe you in order to get you to act unethically and to be able to measure this. We have to deceive you. Very sorry, but we hope that you understand that this is for the benefit of science and this is the only way to do this. Plus, and this is very important in debriefing, especially when we do this kind of thing, and there's potential for harm. Here, the potential for harm is they feel so violated that they never want to participate in experiments again, or they feel so violated that they can't sleep at night, or this is affecting their mental health. So we have to tell them, if you need any support, if there's something that's bothering you, here's the call center, here's the person who is dedicated to helping you overcome any emotional distress or anything. This is very, very important. This is part of the ethics committee. The function of the ethics committee is to make sure that when we run experiments that have potential harm, and this has potential harm, that we know how to protect participants by debriefing them, by telling them what the experiment is about, and by offering services in order to overcome some of the potential downsides for this. I'm on the ethics committee for the undergraduate thesis for social psychology, so I get to see a lot of the experiments. My experiments are rather easy. We run most of the stuff on Qualtrics online, but many of the other people in the clinical, the educational, have things with real impact on people's feelings, on people's beliefs, on people's deeply held, all sorts of things about the universe or about themselves that might be violated if we run a certain experiment. So I'm in a position where I need to demand the experimenters to make sure that they're protecting their participants. So here is a study. This is published in Psychological Bulletin. So this is one of our top journals. And this journal only publishes two kinds of evidence, either systematic reviews of the literature or something that's called a meta-analysis. Meta-analysis kind of takes a whole domain, a whole area of research and tries to summarize this for us with effect sizes. So you've seen a meta-analysis before when we looked at all the replications, and then you saw this diamond at the end that says a meta-analysis summary of all the effects together. All right, so here we see the truth about lies, a meta-analysis of dishonest behavior that's looking at all the findings about honesty together. Here we can see all the different ways by which we measure lying. We can do a matrix, just like the first one that we saw, with matching which two numbers actually together combined to 10, so solving 20 puzzles. There's the die roll. So we saw the die roll. So how much did you get? Is it the top? Is it the bottom? Sometimes the die roll is giving people a cup that has a hole in it and asked to shake the cup and then look in between and report what it is that they found. So we can't see what they got. They can see, but then we can ask them to report what it is and estimate whether this is unethical or not. And then a coin flip and sender receiver. I won't go into this, just know that there is more and more methods. And on the left, you see the rate of lying. So just like at the beginning, the first suggestion was, do they lie or don't they lie? There's an award. Did you get the award or not get the award? And did you exaggerate your performance to get that award or not? So rate of lying, anything that's above 0. Either you lied, doesn't matter if you lied once or 10 times, you lied, this is lying, or 0, you didn't lie. And here you can see that the different rates about rate of lies is about 50%, depending on the different procedures. And you can see that actually most of these, like sender receiver, the matrix, and the die roll, are as effective. Coin flip is a little bit lower than that. But when we come to the measuring the degree, actually the matrix question is not very good at capturing the degree. It's kind of like the lowest, but it's still, there's 17% people lie, but with the sender receiver, it seems like there's more than 50% of people that's lying. So if you plan to do something about unethical behavior, you can go into a meta-analysis and see the different kinds of procedures. Your opinions, before I show you Dan Ariely and his insights on this, I'm going to ask you a series of questions of who cheats more. So do Americans cheat more? Do Chinese cheat more? Or Israelis? Me and Dan Ariely as being Israeli. Who cheats more? All right, once you've tackled this, who cheats more? Is it politicians or bankers? What's the next one? What other categories am I going to ask you about? Who cheats more, males or females? So before I show you the results and before I show you Dan Ariely and what he reports, I'm going to ask you, what is your prediction here? It doesn't depend on who, so all of them are about the same. So that's your prediction, all of them are about the same. Is that what usually people report? So this is your own belief that people are about the same. What do you think most people think? Americans don't think that they cheat the most? I'm Israeli. What do you think Israelis feel? Of course, I think Israelis do not cheat. Okay, why is that? Interesting, because this can go two ways, right? Because you're attached to your culture, you actually know a lot more about this culture and you've had a lot more exposure to this culture and you read a lot more news about this culture. So it could be that, they're in my in-group, so I don't see them as cheaters, but it could be that you've had a lot of, actually, if you've asked me before I knew this finding, I was positive that Israelis cheat a lot more than Chinese and Americans. I had no doubt whatsoever, given my exposure to Israeli culture. What do you think Americans will say? Americans also believe that Americans cheat more than the Chinese. If you ask Chinese are positive that Chinese more than everybody else. How about this one? Who cheats more, the bankers or politicians? What's your hypothesis here? First of all, what do you think people will answer? Your opinion? Politicians, why? So massive influence. Okay, a lot of impact. Bankers? So this is a really good question to ask. When is it more difficult to cheat? What is the number one thing that's... So first of all, what do we hear more about? Bankers or politicians who are cheating? Seems like we hear a lot more about politicians. But this is another thing that's paradoxical about finding dishonesty. If we find more reporting dishonesty for politicians, does this mean that they actually cheat more, or does it mean that we find out more about their cheating? So I think bankers, very, very close to the money, very easy for them to do all sorts of things. Now, of course, we have all checks and balances, right? But they deal with the money all the time, and they're much more clever in how to, balance the books. Politicians can't cheat by themselves. They need a large group of people. Plus, they have much higher visibility. So we see politicians all the time. There's paparazzi running after them. Everything that they do, we track. So actually, it's a lot more difficult for politicians to cheat on this. But I think your intuition is correct, that most people will feel like politicians are, 92% cheat more. And we'll see what the answer from Dana really is to this. How about males and females? Any hypothesis of males or females? What kind of things do males cheat about? Like in dating profiles, what is the number one thing they cheat about? Height, wealth, these kinds of things, right? Yeah. How about females? Age, very good. Anything else? Weight, yeah. So there's all different things that people are sensitive about. So I guess context really matters, what kind of place we look at this. But overall, we have some findings about this that I will share with you right after the 10-minute break. Are you ready for some findings? So who cheats more? American, Chinese, Israeli. Who cheats more? Bankers or politicians? Who cheats more? Males or females? Let's see what Dana really has to say about this.
Forward TV. The world is thinking.
So in the cheating stuff, people think that there's going to be cultural differences. So we tried this. So I grew up in Israel, and I tried to see whether the Israelis cheat more than Americans. Actually, before I tell you about this, how many people here kind of grew up in different countries? Okay, how many of you think that in your original country people cheat more than Americans? Raise your hand. Almost everybody. It's really interesting. Aside from the Canadians, I find that everybody feel that their country of origin cheats more. So we tried this. We tried Israel. Turns out the Israelis cheat just like the Americans. My Italian collaborator was certain. She was willing to bet money that the Italians would cheat more than the Americans. They cheat just the same. My Chinese collaborator was sure that the Chinese would cheat more than Americans. They cheat just the same. We're trying more countries.
And what is your exact experiment or test?
Yeah, I'll tell you in a second. So the exact experiment, the exact experiment is we give people a sheet of paper and we say, solve these problems, we'll pay you $1 per question. And for some people, we say, when you finish, shred the piece of paper and just tell us how many questions you solved correctly. So now you have an opportunity to exaggerate. And we actually know how many questions you solved, so we can check how much people cheating. We did find one cultural difference. And the cultural difference is we went to Washington, D.C. We set up the experiment in bars where congressional staffers hang out in. And then we went to New York City and we created the same experiment in bars where bankers hang out in. Now, let's consult your intuition. Who do you think cheats more? Who votes for bankers? Who votes for politicians? Yeah. So that was my intuition, but the bankers cheat about 2 to 1. But I should say one thing, which is these were congressional staffers, so they're junior politicians, right? They haven't. More research is needed.
Yeah, so this is supported by some evidence. It does seem like bankers cheat more, and I think it does have something to do with visibility and access to money and knowing how money goes around. It's very difficult for politicians to be able to do this for a very long time unless the entire ecosystem of that country and the social norms allow for politicians to cheat. How about the male-female one? Same meta-analysis. The nice thing that you can do in a meta-analysis is also see according to the samples, mixed samples, male, female, the ratios and all that. I don't know how much you can see over here, but the scale here is the average of male minus the average of female. So anything that is above 0 is more cheating for males. Anything that under 0 is more cheating for females. So if you can see the 0 here, males is the higher one. So here we have a 6%, we have 4%, 4%, and 2%, depending on the kind of method that we use. But in general, it does seem like males are more dishonest than females. When we look at what is the difference between lab experiments versus field experiments, so many times people, when we do experiments in psychology, people in the field say, this doesn't generalize. How do you know that it's generalized? And actually, when we run the same kind of experiments, both in the lab and in the field, we can see that the effect sizes are not as different as we could have imagined. So there seems to be some kind of rate, especially with the sender receiver. The rates seem to be quite similar between the lab and the field, or around 50%. However, the matrix one doesn't really work very well in the field, let's say educational environments and so forth. So the cheating ratio really goes down when we go to the field. So if you are planning to do something in the field, if you become an educational psychologist or industrial organizational psychologist, and you do all sorts of things in the field, as HR, as behavioral insights, as UX researchers, as marketing, whatever it is that you're going to do in your career, let's say that you want to know the extent to which people are misbehaving, not reporting their CVs and their applications correctly, and so forth. There's all sorts of experiments that you can do in order to establish this sort of thing on a small sample in order to know how the organization can overcome these. So meta-analysis, and this is a recent one from 2019, is a good way of you to aggregate all the findings together. So the takeaways so far that I want to kind of relate to you is that, first of all, we can study unethicality. We can do some really interesting experiments where we measure unethicality, and we manipulate all sorts of things like corruption and other different factors. And it does seem like unethicality differs among people, depending on the ability to rationalize this, motivations, the context, and so forth. It depends on the type of behavior, and it also depends on how we measure it. This is all to say, so this is just a teaser session, so that unethicality is a very complex kind of behavior, and what we know right now is just the beginning of this whole thing. Studying unethical behavior, I'm going to, all right. Go back on the Mentimeter. This is rather long, so I'm going to read this together with you. And this is a classic experiment that we replicated as part of the mass replication effort. This is one of the first ones that I ever did when I was a postdoc in Maastricht University. And the scenario is like this. Ivan is allergic to the house dressing, but he doesn't know. Ivan gets a stomach ache and ends up losing the match. Rate John's morality. So I'm going to give you 3 scenarios, and let's read the story together. The story is like this. John is attending a tennis tournament and has made it to the final where he is facing Ivan. The first prize is $10,000 US dollars. John loves to win, but he thinks that Ivan is better than him. Both of these finalists, both John and Ivan, meet for dinner the night before the match the next morning. John knows that Ivan is allergic to pepper. He also knows that the house dressing contains pepper. John thinks if Ivan eats the house dressing, he will get a serious stomach ache, won't sleep the whole night, and I will win. So at dinner, Ivan orders first, and he's asked what dressing he wants. Ivan does not know that the house dressing contains pepper. Okay, 3 scenarios. Scenario A. Before Ivan makes a choice, John recommends that Ivan tries the house dressing. Ivan orders the house dressing and gets a serious stomachache. John wins the match. How moral is John? Second scenario, Ivan orders the house dressing. John says nothing. Ivan ends up getting a stomachache. John wins the match. How moral is John? Third scenario, Ivan orders first. Ivan orders the Italian dressing, which doesn't have any problem. Then John recommends that Ivan tries the house dressing instead. Ivan changes his mind, orders the house dressing, gets a serious stomachache. John wins the match. Really complicated, very long scenario, but we have three different scenarios. The outcome is exactly the same. In all of this, there was harm. Ivan got the stomachache because he had the house dressing, and because of that, allegedly, John won the match. The question is there any difference between these three scenarios? So as you answer this, try and think, what is the hypothesis here? What's differentiating between scenario A, scenario B, and scenario C? What kind of differences do you see here? What is this about? What is the experimental design? What am I manipulating? Yeah, so our dependent variable is moral responsibility. Why should there be a difference between the three scenarios? What's the manipulation? So whether the choice of taking the house dressing was done by Ivan or was done by John. In all of this, actually, Ivan does the choice, but what's the difference between the three? The recommendation, right? So in which, how would you categorize this differentiation? So whether there's a real action that was taken by recommending something or just passively, I didn't do anything. He is going to take the house dressing, but I didn't warn him. So something that's more active and something that's more passive. Good. But we have two scenarios that are active. What's the difference between them? Before and after the choice is made. Why would that matter? Yeah, it's like you're actively asking the person to change into something that might hurt them, right? So what's your prediction here in differences between the three scenarios? What's going to be the highest, the most immoral one? C, okay, because, yes, so both the after the person have already made a harmless decision, plus it's active, right? What's going to be the second one? Yeah, an action, however, before he made, right? And then the least one is the more passive one, right? Okay, so let's see how this works. Yeah, so C is the most immoral, A before. So in line with your predictions, it seems like we have a successful replication. And this is actually what it is that we found. So you can see over here exactly the same thing, commission after, commission before. So omission is the passive, commission is the active. So commission after a person has made a choice by making them change the kind of thing is seen to be the most immoral. All of these are immoral, immorality of 50 and above, but it seems like the most immoral is this one. So participants in the harm through commission conditions rated harm as more immoral. This is called omission bias, where people prefer harm in order to not be judged, they prefer doing harm indirectly, passively. So we were able to replicate this. This is especially relevant now. We also did a meta-analysis on this that was published very recently, I think 2 months ago, with Kit, who is supporting us in our projects. And generally, this is used for vaccinations decisions. The whole omission bias started out with vaccinations, because it seems like this was conducted initially in the US before pandemic and before everything else. This was with flu shots, that people were hesitant to take action and vaccinate their kids against the flu because they preferred harm coming through the flu, which has nothing to do with them, than harm coming through vaccinations. So they preferred harm that it's happening, them being passive, them not vaccinating against the flu, than harm that's done when they're active and they took somebody to take a vaccination and then had some side effects. So a preference for omission, harm through omission. The second one that we're not going to do together, so I'm going to skip this one, is preference for indirect harm. So people prefer to do harm indirectly. Another successful replication that we published with all these students, both in Psych 2020 and in Psych 3052. I think that was like a year ago. And now I'm going to show you case studies. Now that we've reflected on, Dan Ariely and behavioral ethics, and we know something about morality and unethical behavior and how we judge all these things, I want to take us and connect this to open science and why we need open science and what happens when we try and replicate some of the classic findings. So I'll show you a video when Dan Ariely explained this self-concept maintenance theory that he published in 2008.
Now, how would you test a personal fudge factor? Initially, we said, what can we do to shrink the fudge factor? So we got people to the lab, and we said, we have 2 tasks for you today. First, we asked half the people to recall either 10 books they read in high school or to recall the 10 commandments. And then we tempted them with cheating. Turns out, the people who tried to recall the 10 commandments, and in our sample, nobody could recall the 10 commandments, but those people who tried to recall the 10 commandments, given the opportunity to cheat, did not cheat at all. It wasn't that the more religious people, the people who remembered more of the commandment, cheated less, and the less religious people, the people who couldn't remember almost any commandment, cheated more. The moment people thought about trying to recall the 10 commandments, they stopped cheating. In fact, even when we give self-declared atheists the task of swearing on the Bible and we give them a chance to cheat, they don't cheat at all. Now, 10 commandments is something that is hard to bring into the education system, so we said, why don't we get people to sign the honor code? So we got people to sign. I understand that this short survey falls under the MIT honor code. Then they shredded it, no cheating whatsoever. And this is particularly interesting because MIT doesn't have an honor code.
Really interesting. This is a very famous TED Talk, viewed millions of times. This was also communicated in the books. So this is a classic finding. I took this RRR assessment presentation. You didn't need to do presentations for your RRR assessments, but 2 years ago they did. So this group of students over here presented this, and I took this from them. So it's dishonesty of honest people, a theory of self-concept maintenance. And basically it said that people need reminders. If you remind them to be moral and ethical, just like when you are faced with a lock, locks are fairly easy to overcome. If you go on YouTube and you go into a hardware store, you can pick a lock. So locks are not a big barrier for us to overcome, but it is a reminder that, okay, this is perhaps a place that I'm not supposed to go into. This is confined by something. There's a reason why there's a lock here, so I'm not supposed to go further. If you ask people to sign things, even if they don't exist, like a moral code of MIT or 10 commandments, even if you're not religious or Christian at all, 10 commandments just to recall them, these are moral reminders that help us to act more honestly. And okay, now I remember that I need to not cheat on the test. All sorts of things that are puzzling about this, because you're already doing a test, you know that you're not supposed to cheat on this, but they were able to find this. More recently, we did the mass replication effort. This is some of the scenarios. They decided to focus on experiment 1 and the religious reminders, but actually they've done many experiments of this with all sorts of experiments in this 2008 paper. So this hasn't been directly replicated, and they try to replicate the same thing. And this is the RRR assessment, final summary of all the replication efforts. So the original one, now you know how to read this kind of meta-analysis forest plot. The original effect was over here. So here we have the columns with the means, and we have the number of participants in conditions. So the first one that they published in 2008 was not that big sample. So it's 106 participants to contrast between them. And you can see that the effect size is quite large. The difference between the two groups is quite large. But when we try to replicate this with all these different labs, some of them I know, we can see that it's all over the place, and most of them overlap with the null. When we look at the actual meta-analysis, this is 0.11, but it overlaps with the null. So this is a failed replication. So we were not able to replicate this effect from Dana Ariely. So the question is, what do Dana Ariely and the others, how do they react to this? So they had a response, and the response was kind of like mixed. And this is kind of like the typical response that we get when we submit replications, the replications that you're going to do when we submit this to journals. And if they fail, usually the original authors are like, of course this failed because you didn't do this. What didn't you do? You didn't, direct replication is challenging and it lacks flexibility. Generally, you need to adjust this by doing a conceptual replication rather than direct replications. So we're doing direct replications even for things from 20 years ago, 40 years ago. We're trying to see if this applies here, and we're not doing too many adjustments. We're adjusting this to an online sample. We're adjusting this to a more diverse sample. We're adjusting this to call checks, which we didn't have 40 years ago. But generally, the stimuli, we try to be as close as possible to what it is that they report. And they're saying, of course, you didn't find this because cultural differences, because of acceptance of deception, moral association, incentive compatibility, lack of anonymity, and so forth. And then I highlighted some of the things that I thought were relevant. We realized that there was more challenges than one would think. We do not have a record of what it is that they've done, so they had to guess a lot of things, the replicators, and these deviations probably explain why this wasn't replicated. We tend to favor conceptual rather than direct replications, which to me doesn't make a lot of sense. And unfortunately, the rules for the current grand replication attempt were stricter and did not allow for much flexibility, which would explain why this has failed. But I really like this little comment over here. We're humbled and thankful and hope to continue learning from the results. To me, so there's a failed replication. At the very least, we should be updating our knowledge that perhaps this is not a consistent effect, and perhaps we need to clear our books and our TED Talks. But just like you saw the TED Talk that I just showed you, the TED Talks are still there. So we're not updating our knowledge. Now, this is a first step. I'm showing you this is a first case study. I think the more important one is the second case study about nudging honesty. And I'm going to show you what Dana Ariely talks about regarding this study.
We went to UCLA and we asked about 500 students to try and recall the 10 commandments. By the way, none of them could. This was interesting by itself. They made up all kind of new commandments. But after just trying to remember the 10 commandments, we gave them the same task in which they could cheat. What happened? Nobody cheated. Now, it wasn't as if the people who remembered many commandments didn't cheat and the people who remembered few commandments cheated. Nobody cheated. That basically suggests that once you get people to consider their own moral code, we basically kind of reduce the flexibility by which we could justify all kinds of moral behavior. We ran a similar experiment, by the way, with a big insurance company. The only thing we did was we changed the line on the signature. Usually in insurance form, you fill the insurance form and you sign at the bottom. By the time people sign at the bottom, they finish cheating. It's over, right? So we changed the line and we got people to sign up front. Turns out people cheat much less when they first sign.
So the first one was a recap of the 10 commandments, but the one I wanted you to listen to is about the insurance company, which is a very impactful finding that they published in a big journal called PNAS. And this is the finding. Signing at the beginning makes ethics salient and decreases dishonest self-reports in comparison to signing at the end. So they showed in one of the experiments, I think it's the third experiment. Yeah, the third experiment, that actually they went to an insurance company, they worked together with an insurance company, and the insurance company had two kinds of forms. In one, they signed at the beginning, and in the other, they signed at the end. And basically, they've shown that people report a lot higher mileage when they sign at the beginning, which means that they need to pay more for the insurance, which they associate with being more honest. So the difference was about 2,427.8 miles per car. That is, asking customers to sign at the beginning of the form led to a 10% increase in implied miles driven, which is the more accurate, honest behavior compared to people underreporting in the typical form. What you can see here is that these effects are very, very significant, lower than 0.00001, big effects. And this actually informed a lot of policy It's included in policy recommendations. So when we did perspective of psychological science, we communicated this, that we need to include this. The first principle is to remind people. This emphasizes the effectiveness of subtle cues to increase the salience of morality. So 10 Commandments perhaps doesn't replicate, but we've seen this with even an insurance company in the field, that this actually has implications for people behaving more honestly, tax compliance, compliance with handicapped parking. So they've shown this in different policy recommendations. And actually, many places, I think both in Israel and in the US, implemented this kind of policy change based on that PNAS publication. The remarkable thing, and this doesn't happen very often, then we in the open science community really were surprised that the original authors actually joined a replication attempt of their original findings, and they decided to conduct the same experiment again, also going into the field and also conducting many of these experiments. Yeah, and you can see the same people. So Dan Ariely is here, and the same group, Max Bazerman, Francesca Gino. So these are big people in the behavioral ethics team, but they joined two others that decided that they want to replicate this effect. And as you can see, this was also published in PNAS. And I have to tell you, we've tried to get replications, not just me, the open science community have tried many times to get replications in PNAS. Impossible. The fact that the original authors did a replication is amazing. The fact that they got this into PNAS is unbelievable. This is an amazing achievement for open science and for replications. Now, what happened with the replication is just like it's going to happen with you. We share in the open science community, when we do replications, everything about the materials, the data, the code, to analyze the data. But these authors did even more than that. Not only did they share what it is that they published recently, but they also shared what it is that they've done in 2012. So in 2012, the original one, they actually didn't share any of the data. But when they published a replication, they shared the data. This is what they found. Conclusion, false positive findings. Therefore, we conclude from this data that there is no good evidence for the existence of this effect, and the limited time that's been documented in the literature is likely a type 1 error. So they said, we didn't do a good enough job. Probably we should have done this again, ran this again before running to publish it in PNAS. Now we've corrected this. As you can see, if I can still show you videos from YouTube, the videos are still there. The TED Talk is still going to be there. Nobody is going to change the books. So we have a problem with updating the general knowledge. But the reason why I'm showing you this case study is not just because of this. This, just as you see it right now, is a big win for open science. It's a remarkable achievement. If you would ask me a decade ago, there was absolutely no chance of original authors doing replications and getting published in PNAS and admitting to a possibility of a false positive. Max Bazerman, who is one of the authors, recently did a book, Better Perfect. Here's how he reflects about this. Making matters worse, we recently failed to replicate the result, reducing my confidence in the conclusion of the paper. So he talks about his journey, his entire career, and even Max Bazerman in his recent book says, now I don't believe in this finding, therefore we need to update these findings. One of the books that I recommend for you to read is this Better Not Perfect. It's really remarkable to learn from Max Bazerman about aiming for better and not perfect, how perfect is the enemy of good, but we're not going to go into this. So there's lots of reasons why I like this replication effect. There's full transparency, they share everything, etc., etc. Problem is, 2 months ago, a team called Data Colada, the same team who in 2011 published a false positive psychology that started the entire replication crisis in the open science movement, analyzed the data that these authors shared from 2012. And what did they find? Evidence of fraud in influential field experiment about dishonesty. They found indications for fraud in one of the classic findings about dishonesty. How did they do this? Amazing investigative research, a bit like what you did with the RR assessments that nobody ever did before you. So going in and looking at calculations of the effect sizes and trying to see if this is possible or not possible, doing P curves, analyzing stat check and all sorts of stuff like that. For example, This is the first anomaly. Implausible distribution of miles driven. So when they looked at the database and how much people reported that they drove, it was very, very similar, across, the frequency of 0, the frequency of 50,000, the frequency of 30,000, and sometime it just ended. There's nothing above 50,000. This is not plausible because if you look at real reports from insurance companies, it's kind of like a bell curve. So most of the people are kind of like here between the 5,000 and 10,000. There's a lot less that don't really drive. There's a lot less. So this distribution makes absolutely no sense. This is impossible. But they found other indicators. I'm not going to go into this. But the worst one of those is that when they opened the Excel file and they looked at some of the rows that were added actually had a different font. So somebody was really bad at doing copy paste and didn't notice that actually they're doing this. And when they analyzed the kind of font that is very difficult to observe, I don't know if you can even see the difference between these fonts, but they noticed these differences. And when they analyzed this, they showed that actually there's some duplications and people actually added some things in there. Very, very disturbing, amazing detective work by these data colada people. And this led to Shu, so she was the original first author, to say the famous paper synonymous with my name, Shu et al., 2012, published in PNAS, is being retracted. So because of this fraud, decided to retract this study. I should be appalled. Instead, I'm delighted by this piece of investigative data journalism from the brilliant data colada team. I also think this is a big win for open science because there might be a lot of stuff in there, in the literature that's based on data. And because we don't have the data, we can't find that this is fraud. All of you are doing replications. Do you have access to the materials? Do you have access to the data? Do you have access to the code? No, we just trust what it is that they do over there. We need to do these replications in order for us to expose. And it's amazing if through a replication, we also get access to original data, and then we can have red teams and investigative authors to go in and go deeper into this. Unfortunately, this was not the only reaction. You can read about this. For me, this is a big win. I really thought that this would be terrific. However, a lot of people came after Dan Ariely. Unfortunately, I was contacted about this because 2 weeks before this became public, our team, you, students at HKU, identified problems, statistical errors in a different paper by Dan Ariely. 2 weeks before that, Psychological Science and Dan Ariely, because of HKU students, issued an expression of concern, which I thought was remarkable because it really showed that we at HKU help people like Dan Ariely in psychological science correct a mistake. And if you remember, but I mentioned this case study in the first week when I said the amazing things that HKU students are doing. But people are saying, if Dan Ariely did fraud over here, and then he has a lot of statistical mistakes, perhaps there's a big problem with this person. So they came after him, lots of big headlines, some of them mentioning the HKU students, some of them mentioning me, a lot of reporters trying to get some reactions from us. But for me, at least with our case study, I thought this was, a terrific achievement for HKU students and open science because actually we did replications and the replications were successful. When we communicated with Dan Ariely, he was very positive. He is the one, together with psychological science, that actually issued the expression of concern in order to correct the public record. And hopefully our replications will be published soon. So I don't consider this to be a fraud. And in the other fraud case, it's not really clear who did the fraud, the insurance company, Dan Ariely, and I don't see any incentive for Dan Ariely to share his data knowing that there's fraud in there. The big problem, if we go after people for all sorts of problems that we find in their articles, then this creates a whole atmosphere that is not good for science. Why is it not good? Because before, when we saw the replication in PNAS, we thought this is amazing. They share their data, I'll share my data. When I showed people the replication in PNAS, they said, okay, now we have a chance to also revisit our findings. They did replication, I'll do replications. They published a failed replication in PNAS, I'll be able to do this. After this case study with Dan Ariely, when I tell people, are you willing to share your data? When I contact them about your replications, people are like, I don't want to be like Dan Ariely. What if you find some errors in there? So for me, judging people about sharing and opening up is not helpful. We need to set standards from now on, but we can't, look back and, because if we have an atmosphere of suspicion and judging everybody, then we have a real problem in cleaning up our science. Which leads me to the final thing I want to share with you. It's really crucial for science that we open everything up. Open science is not an option, at least for me, if you want to have credible research. About honesty, about dishonesty, like how more ironic can this be? We really need to open everything up, and we need to encourage setting the past straight. The worst thing that can happen is that people are afraid to share. People don't want to tell us what it is that they've done, and people don't want to help you with your applications. I was really hoping that more and more people, when I contact them, will give me their materials and we're willing to share. But now a lot of people are really scared. Well, what's going to happen if it's going to be like the Dan Ariely case? So there's all sorts of really interesting articles that came out from this year, putting the self in self-correction, findings from the loss of confidence project. And I want to show you that big figures in the open science community are admitting that they've done questionable research practices. They say, I lost confidence on this research that I've done. I think in the first or second week, I shared with you that on my website, I'm asking you, check me, replicate me. Here's the stuff that I've done, and I don't know whether this is solid or not. Please, let's replicate this again. If you find any errors, please tell me. When you did your RR assessments about what we did last year, you found some amazing mistakes that now we have the ability to correct in our publications. So we need to be open completely about everything, and we need to report when we've lost confidence in our own findings. One of the amazing examples is from Simin Vazir. Lots of examples, lots of statements, different journal impact factor, different citations, but the biggest one is really impact factor 5.92 and 740 citations to Simin Vazir. And this is what she writes. This is the statement that she writes about her loss of confidence. The main issue was that I ran many more analyses than I reported. And I cherry-picked which results to report. How brave is it that a person is admitting this? In 2010, I didn't know that this is bad. Now I know this is bad and I'm admitting this. So everybody knows to be careful with these findings so we don't have TED Talks. We don't have books about this. This is basically p-hacking. But because most of my results were not statistically significant, I did not quite successfully p-hack by the strict definition. Still, I cherry-picked the results that made the contrast between self-accuracy and so forth and so forth. Amazing. And you have quite a few of those. So hopefully we can see a lot more of that in our community. This really shows reason why I want to discuss unethical behavior, morality. This case study about fraud in dishonest research about dishonesty, is because I want you to understand the importance of what it is that you're doing. My general take on morality and honesty are really complex behaviors. There's lots of things that we need to look at. There's lots of research that has been done, but it has been done prior to our understanding that there's a replication crisis. So we really need to go back, revisit, do some of these experiments again, but we have some really good methods. We now know how to measure unethical behavior. We know how to run these experiments. There's lots of place for you to come in and do some really cool stuff, from vending machines to die roll to matrix questions. So you can come in and really start by replicating and then adding your extensions of what it is that you find to be interesting. So we need a lot more replications. We need to test and retest continuously. And I really would hope that in our field, original authors, like Dan Ariely and others like Simin Vazir would expose more, share more, and that we make this an open environment where everybody can report their loss of confidence in their own findings. We need to investigate fraud, but we don't need to make this a place where we judge everybody for every mistake that has been done. That sums up this about morality and unethical behavior. We're going to touch more about the nuances of morality in upcoming weeks. Any questions about, if you have some questions about replications, extensions, and so forth, I'm going to be here for the next few minutes. Otherwise, you're welcome, of course, to talk to me on Slack. One last thing I want to say, this morning I announced on Slack, they have team evaluations. If you didn't receive the email, then check in your spam or junk email. But this is a mandatory component that you need to do in order to evaluate both your teammates, yourself, and us to help us do better in this course. So please make sure that you do this before Sunday. Any other questions? You can just message me on Slack.